Hi everyone, welcome. I'll just make a slow start to allow everyone to join and connect to audio. Okay, perfect. So it looks like we have most people joined now. So welcome everyone. My name is Megan Winch and I'm one of the recruitment admissions advisors for the Oxford MBA. I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by Dr. Rhonda Haddy, who is the Associate Professor here at the South Business School. Rhonda will be giving us a taster lecture this afternoon, which will hopefully give you an insight into the kind of subjects and discussions you can expect on the Oxford MBA programme. If you do have any questions throughout the session, please do submit these using the Q&A box rather than the chat, as it just makes it a little bit easier for us to see them. So that's everything from me, and I'll hand over to Rhonda. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Megan, and welcome everyone. Really excited to be doing this taster lecture for you today. And I thought maybe I would just start off by introducing myself very briefly and letting you know what you should expect from this lecture. I am a New Yorker, born and bred, but I've been working at Said now for almost 8 years. I can't believe it already. And in terms of teaching, I teach on multiple programs. So of course the MBA, but I also teach on our executive MBA program. I teach undergrads, I teach exec ed, I teach on the AI diploma. So many different types of students I get to interface with. Probably most relevant to you would be what I teach on the MBA. And on the MBA, I co-teach the core marketing course alongside a few of my colleagues. The idea is we want to give you a very multifaceted idea and approach to marketing. So you hear it from a few different angles and a few different perspectives, because we all have unique areas of expertise. In terms of electives, I teach a course on strategic consumer insights, which is all about kind of how do you get inside the head of a consumer and use those insights to be a better marketer. And then I also co-teach an elective on the digital transformation of marketing, media, and advertising, which has traditionally been an international elective that we do in New York City, going to visit many different companies from all different angles of the kind of media and advertising ecosystem. So we visit platforms, both old and new tech platforms, brands, media companies, agencies, etc. That, to be honest, hasn't run the last 2 years because of COVID, but we're really, who knows what's going to happen, but we're really hoping and excited about bringing that back because it's been very successful in the past. And those electives can probably lend you a little bit of insight into my research interests, because when I'm not teaching, I spend the vast majority of my time doing research, because Oxford is, as you probably know, a research-oriented institution. So the bulk of my research is in consumer behavior, where I'm very interested essentially in how and why consumers behave the way that they do. And to uncover those insights, I run experiments on people both in the field and in the lab. And I have two sort of sub areas of focus, which are sensory marketing and consumer interactions with technology. And these aren't completely independent or parallel research streams, because they intersect quite a bit, as you'll see today. But just to give you an idea of what we're going to talk about today, in the core marketing module, we do tend to cover a lot of marketing fundamentals, like from beginning to end. So we talk a lot about kind of the purpose of marketing. A lot of people have the misconception that marketing equals advertising, when that is not the case. We talk about customer centricity, segmentation, targeting, and positioning, all your basic fundamentals related to pricing, channels, communications. But importantly, towards the end of the course, we do try to take a very forward-looking approach to understanding where marketing is headed. And again, this is because we think, one of the benefits of being at a research-oriented university is having professors who are constantly working on kind of cutting-edge marketing research, and it would be a shame if we didn't bring that into the classroom. It's also the case that we have what's called the Future of Marketing Initiative at Said, which is essentially a platform that brings academics and industry partners together. So we have industry partners including, tech giants, Google, Meta, Twitter, but also brands. We've got Mars, L'Oreal, and financial services, all sorts of industry partners who help inform our research. So we work together on research projects, but it's also a great relationship because we get to bring some really great guest speakers into the classroom. So, with that in mind and that kind of forward-looking looking focus, today we're going to talk a little bit about consumer interactions with technology, which, as I mentioned, one of my areas of expertise. There are so many different trends we could talk about. Obviously, we don't have too much time today, so I'm only going to be focused on one of these trends, which is sensory and immersive technology. So I'm going to share some examples, some research findings, and hopefully at the end we'll have time to listen to a short audio clip and really open up the Q&A for some dynamic discussion. Now, if this were a real lecture in person, it would be a much more dynamic discussion, obviously, but we're going to do our best to use the Q&A function to try to mimic that, time allowing. But in the meantime, feel free at any point if you have comments or questions, as Megan mentioned, please go ahead and throw those in the Q&A. I'm constantly monitoring that, and the more two-way of a dialogue we can create, the better. Okay, so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about sensory and immersive technology. And I think here it makes sense to first step back and define what we actually mean by kind of sensory marketing or sensory effects more broadly. Essentially, sensory marketing and sensory research looks at how all 5 of the senses can influence consumer perceptions, their judgments, decision-making, and consumption behavior. So this is a pretty exciting area to work in for a couple of reasons. First of all, from purely academic theoretical point of view, we are constantly uncovering new and sometimes surprising ways these senses can influence the way people behave, oftentimes without them consciously being aware that it's having an effect on the way that they behave. And it's also interesting from a practical angle because we're seeing substantively more and more examples of multisensory appeals in the marketplace. And so this can play out in several different contexts. So for example, it plays out in the way we think of consumers interacting with products, because products themselves look, smell, sound, feel a particular way, and that influences people's evaluation of those products and how they interact with the products. It's also the case that our environments look, smell, sound, feel a particular way, and that influences shopper behavior. So this applies a lot to retail and service atmospherics. And then finally, we're seeing more and more marketing communications that appeal to multiple senses, and there's some interesting findings from that area as well. And so that's kind of what sensory marketing is about. But how does that then intersect with technology? So today I'm going to talk about 3 different modalities. I'm going to start with vision and talk a little bit about how some emerging technologies are intersecting with sensory effects and how that's influencing people's behavior. And so specifically, I'll talk a little bit about visually immersive technologies, including VR, but mostly focused on AR, augmented reality. To begin, I apologize if this is review, but it's often the case that people misuse or conflate virtual and augmented reality, or use the terms VR and AR interchangeably, when they're actually very different technologies, both practically and theoretically, in terms of the sort of psychology behind consumer behavior. So virtual reality typically requires a headset, and you can sort of think about that headset almost as headphones, but for the eyes, right? Because it's completely removing you from your current environment and immersing you into a fully digital environment. So you could sort of think about the process at work here when you're in a VR experience as one of transportation. That is very different than augmented reality, which applications typically involve you staying in your current reality. All it requires is a camera, which is available obviously on all our mobile devices. And what it does is overlay digital objects into your current real world, hence augmenting it, right? And so the process at work here isn't transporting you to kind of a different reality, it's superimposing or augmenting your current reality. And that's a very different effect. And for many reasons, including the fact that, we all have device cameras all the time, not necessarily access to VR headsets all the time. There's generally been more excitement about applications and the potential proliferation of augmented reality as compared to virtual reality. Now, just to kind of give you a few real world examples, many of these applications I'm sure you're familiar with. So some very popular AR applications involve the front facing camera on your phone, the selfie camera, where you can, use an Instagram picture here. This is my toddler with a beard and glasses, courtesy of an Instagram filter. Snapchat just last month introduced a shopping catalog via the front-facing camera, AR, where you could, try on different types of makeup, sunglasses, hats, etc., and buy right within the app. But other applications use the phone's rear-facing camera to superimpose objects into your kind of current environment. So you can think of kind of classic Pokemon Go, where you would see the characters in the current physical space that you're in. Or the IKEA Place app that allows you to see furniture in, let's say, your living room, etc., before you buy. And so AR is kind of a big deal just in terms of how much investment it has gone into and is continuously going into it. Pretty much every single major tech player is investing or is rumored to be investing in new AR software and hardware, including AR glasses. And I really like this quote by Charlie Fink, which says, "The world is about to be painted with data. The canvas is as broad as the physical world, as blank as a fresh sheet of paper." And sort of that's, to me, I envision a world in which if we are wearing these AR glasses, we have this ability to see an augmented world, and there's likely no going back. Now, my colleagues and I were particularly interested in the fact that a lot of beverage and food players were really quick to embrace the potential of AR, both in terms of kind of corporate, large corporate fast food chains, Domino's Pizza, Panera Bread, Subway, Dunkin' Donuts, but also more smaller independent dining establishments who are using things like AR menus in their restaurants to help depict their foods. And so my colleagues and I found this interesting, but it hadn't really been studied in a systematic way. And we were kind of curious, well, is this just gimmickry where people are having fun with a new technology? Or is there actually something systematic here that could be driving consumer behavior? And so we ran a series of studies, both in the lab and in restaurants, essentially comparing people's reactions to foods that they would view in 3D format on, let's say, a tablet or on their phones, versus that same exact depiction superimposed into their reality via augmented reality. And what we found is that when people view the food item through their device camera, so it looks as if it's virtually present, that increases how desirable people feel the product is and their tendency to purchase the product. And that's because when you see a product in front of you, you can more readily simulate consumption of that item, what's called mental simulation. And when you actually imagine yourself eating the item, that makes you desire it and decide to purchase it more, which we found was a pretty pervasive effect in all the different studies that we ran, again, in restaurants, in the lab, etc. And so that has all sorts of implications you can think about for food and beverage players, both in terms of ordering at restaurants, but also in terms of ordering at home through, let's say, like Uber Eats, Deliveroo, etc., but also different types of promotions and even applications in retail. But it's really interesting to think about how this, of course, goes beyond food and other situations in which that mental stimulation might drive or improve desirability or purchase intentions. And so, there are tons of examples, again, beyond food, whether it be more utilitarian functions like being able to see whether or not a piece of furniture fits in your space, to more fun examples, maybe like seeing a pair of shoes on your feet, etc. So lots of applications and research to still be done, quite frankly. But one area that I find particularly interesting is how AR applies to increasing feelings of human or social presence. And so one of my doctoral students, again, this is another benefit of being at a research university as opposed to just, a standalone business school, is, we work with people in other departments. And one of my doctoral students is an opera singer, but she's a doctoral student in the Department of Experimental Psychology. And so she's very interested in how artist-fan connections develop and the role that technology can play in developing artist-fan connections. And so there are really interesting examples of using AR to kind of bring your favorite artist closer to you in a way that kind of feels real. There are a few years back, there's this example of Childish Gambino, the rapper, in this promotion for Google Pixel, where you could see him singing and dancing wherever you happen to be, in your living room, in your bathroom, in your backyard. And the argument here is that by seeing that presence in a space that's intimate and relevant to you, you feel closer to the artist than, let's say, if you were viewing them on stage at a concert, etc. And so that's been done already in several different contexts. But what's really cool is actually one of our MBA alums is marketing manager for this company, Volugrams, which actually has made that technology very accessible in mobile form, so that you can do really quick kind of shots of yourself, send it to a friend, and then that friend can see you doing whatever you did, a little dance in augmented reality in their space. And so that's kind of the first example of it being in consumer hands and in mobile form. Right now, because of kind of processing requirements, those clips have to be really short. But as processing capabilities and infrastructure increase, we could expect more and more of that, including applications of real-time human presence. And so there are all sorts of pieces of hardware and equipment that allow you to capture yourself or others in a volumetric fashion in real time. That means capture your kind of 3D image of yourself and superimpose that into a viewer's space in real time, sort of viewed as a bit of a hologram. So these examples are from a company called Scatter and their Depth Kit. But at South by Southwest just earlier, I think earlier this week, or was it end of last week, there was another example of a company that's doing some really compelling, it's called Proto, that's doing some really compelling real-time volumetric capture and projection. So really interesting, again, to think about this in the realm of human presence, how augmented reality can increase human presence. You can think about the social function, but you can also think about functions related to the services industry, having a hotel concierge welcome you to your room in a hotel via augmented reality, etc. So those are some examples involving vision, but I think it's really, really interesting to also consider other sensations. I think vision tends to be the most obvious, especially when we think about technology. But oftentimes the other senses, especially if we think about kind of metaverse applications that people are getting excited about, it's really easy to overlook the other senses, which is a missed opportunity, I would argue. And one sense that's important to look at is audition, or our sense of hearing, partially because consumers today are exposed to more digital audio than they ever have been before. This is due to music streaming and podcast streaming apps like Spotify, also audio chat rooms like Clubhouse, and kind of audio-centric video sharing platforms like TikTok. So it actually used to be the case in social media that social media platforms would tell brands to advertise for a sound-off world, with that assumption, but that is no longer the case. we see lots of kind of hardware investments also in spatial audio and different spatial audio applications. So one stat, trying to remember the exact stat, if you looked at just Apple AirPods, sale of Apple AirPods, that would actually be the size of Uber or Nvidia. Like that's how ubiquitous wireless headsets are right now. And a lot of these industry players are investing in new technologies, including spatial audio applications. And so I thought I'd talk a little bit about just spatial audio as one example, again, just to highlight some research that we're doing here at the business school. But first, just to define what spatial audio is. You have a formal definition here in terms of what spatial audio is, but the way that I like to describe or explain spatial audio is that it's essentially audio that mimics the dynamism and realism of real world audio. So just like in the real world, if you were to, let's say, approach a ticking clock, as you get closer, the ticking should get louder. As you retreat, the ticking should get quieter. If you were to turn your head to the left, you would hear it louder in your right ear. If you were to turn your head to the right, you'd hear it louder in your left ear. You can hear whether something's coming from behind you, on top of you, etc. So that sort of dynamism you're able to experience through spatial audio, as opposed to just sort of static sound. So we've been particularly interested in working with some of our industry partners in exploring how this might apply to advertising contexts, among other contexts. I'll show you an example. It's not going to be perfect if you're not wearing headphones, but just to give you an idea of how spatial audio works. And this is in the context of an advertisement, an AR advertisement for Perrier sparkling water. So hopefully you have volume on. So here you can see in the AR application, as you approach the bottle, bubbles get louder. If you're moving away, it gets a little bit quieter. Again, if you were to turn right or left, the idea here basically is sound now is spatially anchored to a certain spot, and so it's mimicking the dynamism of real world sound. And so we've explored people's, I won't make you watch it again. We've been exploring people's reactions to spatial audio, and what we find is that it actually increases or improves people's reactions to the featured products that they view in such advertisements. So it improves everything from product desirability to perceptions of how modern the brand is, to how much people enjoy the experience, to their intentions to actually purchase the products. And what we find is the reason that kind of dynamic or spatial audio does this is that it makes you feel more immersed in the experience than you would with just static audio. Because again, just as visual audio can create these more immersive environments, visually immersive technologies can do that rather, so can auditorily immersive technologies. But what we really find is important is that your applications need to encourage the consumer to actually move or physically approach products in a particular way, because if that's the only way you'll actually experience the dynamism, right? So if you move closer, you notice it's louder. If you move away, you notice it's quieter. Again, turning side to side, etc. But if you were to be completely still, you wouldn't necessarily be able to notice that dynamism. So there are things you have to kind of do in the applications to encourage that, like you saw in the Perrier example, like approach to pop the top of the bottle open, etc. And so essentially, based on this research we've been working on for over a year now, we suggest that when you create interactive content, for example, in the metaverse, you really want the dynamism of the audio to match the dynamism of the visual content. So if you're trying to get people to view things in 3D, you should allow them to hear in 3D as well. And this can provide a lot of benefits to content creators, not just brands, but certainly in advertising contexts. Now, the last modality I'll speak to a little bit is our sense of touch, which is also known as haptics, and how that intersects with technology. I think it's a particularly fascinating area to explore for a few different reasons. First of all, touch is the first of our senses to develop, and skin is our largest sensory organ. And many people would say in the hierarchy of senses that touch is really on top, because while you can, see, smell, or hear somebody or something in a distance, touch typically requires that person or thing to be in what we call your peripersonal space. And so for that reason, there's something extremely powerful and pervasive about touch that is hard to mimic in other modalities. It's also, I think, exciting to explore these applications because touch is arguably one of the most underutilized senses, particularly because today's generation is more touch starved than any before. And that's even before the COVID pandemic, which I'll talk about for a second. It's really interesting to see how, during, especially at the heights of the pandemic, when most people were socially isolating, and most of our interactions were digital or virtual in nature, touch seems to have become even more important, right? So if you think about kind of some of the most popular hobbies during the COVID pandemic were highly tactile things like baking, particularly kneading bread, gardening, even jigsaw puzzles, analog jigsaw puzzles, I should specify, made such a comeback that a lot of brands jumped on board. And so this sort of suggests that, if anything, it's not like virtual immersion, gets rid of our need for touch. It actually seems to be exacerbating our need for physical tangibility. It's just something innate that we have. And so that kind of begs this question: if touch is indeed so important, then how does that relate to interactions that we have, which are mediated through technology? How does touch manifest through technology? There are several different ways, and I would argue that we're seeing more and more ways this manifests. Kind of one basic fact is that touch screens have by far become the dominant user interface. So there's lots of effects there that are interesting to explore. Also, the fact that wearable computing, whether it be fitness bands or smart watches, rings, gloves, etc., essentially strap connectivity onto our skin. So we have this vehicle for touching our skin, sometimes 24 hours a day. And also the fact that the Internet of Things revolution means that now our entire tangible world and all its sensory richness is essentially has digital capability. So it's no longer the case that you have to, go online on a kind of cold, hard interface, but our entire sensory rich world is connected. So I'll talk a little bit about some explorations in that, starting off with how haptics might apply to, and haptic feedback specifically might apply to advertising. To do this, I think it makes sense to step back really, really briefly and look at kind of the sensory evolution, I should say, of mass media advertising. And the earliest forms of advertising were purely visual in nature. So if you think about kind of print ads, billboards, those have existed for a very long time. And then with the advent of radio, we all of a sudden had forms of audio-based advertising, which then became more complex with the introduction of TV. Now you had visual and audio combined. And it's interesting because at the beginning, anytime you have a new medium, people don't necessarily know what to do with it. And so early TV was essentially, men sitting at a desk with a microphone talking just like they had on radio, but now it's being televised. And then we got more advanced with cinematography, etc. But what's really interesting in the last, 15 years or so, with the ubiquity of mobile phones, now all of a sudden you also can reach people at scale through their sense of touch, because we're holding these devices in our hands almost all the time, right? And so it's really interesting to think about how that modality has never been a possibility, at least at scale, before, and now it is because of how ubiquitous mobile phones and wearable computing is in general. So some research that we've been doing and exploring at the business school is how haptic feedback in mobile phones can influence people's responses to media content, and particularly with a focus on advertising. And so, for example, if you were to feel certain Stoli vodka ads, if you were to view them on your mobile phone, you could actually feel your phone shake in unison with the woman shaking a cocktail. Or for the television show Homeland, for advertisements for that, you can actually feel every explosion kind of rumble in your mobile phone. And this is because all of our mobile phones have what are known as haptic actuators built into them. And those are becoming increasingly sophisticated. So for example, a few years back, I can't remember which iPhone it was, maybe iPhone 7 was the first that removed the headphone jack. And that was actually to make space for a more nuanced haptic actuator. I think it's called, they call it a taptic engine, I believe, which can offer more complex sensations. So, you know, when I first mentioned haptic feedback, most of us might just think of something like, you know, basic buzz that comes from our phone, but actually those sensations can be pretty complex in the way that they manifest. So they can feel soft, they can feel hard, they can, you know, be of high or low frequency, you know, you can feel a heartbeat, etc. And these sorts of applications aren't new. For example, if we think about the gaming industry and, you know, force feedback in remote game controllers, you know, if you get shot, etc. But again, the idea that we have mobile phones on us all the times in our hands mean, why not try to extend that to other applications and things that we're doing on our mobile phones, right? And so kind of beyond advertising with that in mind, but still within very much a marketing lens, some brands have been exploring the idea of haptic branding. So for example, if you pay with your smartwatch or phone at the point of purchase, Visa has now kind of a signature haptic, I think of something like tap, 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 tap. I can't remember exactly the rhythm. That's like a signature sensation associated with their brand. And so you can see how this kind of opens up a whole new world for how brands might choose to express themselves in different sensorial ways. So it's not too dissimilar to sonic branding when, you know, you can think of kind of if you open up Netflix, there's that like dong, like, or the sounds that other products make that are very distinct, but no reason to mimic that in other modalities, including our sense of touch. Now, it's also really interesting to think about how this applies to other contexts, because, you know, I'd be remiss, I think, to not mention AI at all in a conversation about consumer interactions with technology. It is, you know, AI, and particularly humanized AI, is an entire topic that we talk about as well. But I think the temptation oftentimes when we think about AI in a sensory way or in tangible form is to sort of think about these very cold, metallic robots or manifestations of AI, when actually sensations can play a huge role here as well. And so I thought what we do next is I'd have you listen to an audio clip. It's audio only, so don't be surprised that there's no video. It's just over 4 minutes long, so it's not too long. Of one of my colleagues at MIT, Sherry Turkle, discuss one such robot that I'd argue is highly sensorial. And then I'm going to share some discussion questions for you, and I'm hoping we'll get a little bit of dialogue and back and forth in the Q&A. I've noticed nobody's asked any questions yet, so I hope that you find the content interesting and have some comments or questions. But I'll go ahead and play this audio clip, and then we'll turn to the questions.
So one day, a few years ago, an MIT professor named Sherry Turkle saw something that would change almost everything she believed, because up until that point, Sherry Turkle was the poster child for the tech revolution, literally.
I was on the cover of Wired magazine.
The April 1996 issue, and she was a total evangelist for all the new ways we were interacting with technology.
My idea was that we would use what we learned in the virtual world to better our lives in the real world.
Anyway, that day, Sherry went to a nursing home. It was outside Boston, and she went there to see something absolutely amazing. Sherry and her graduate students would watch an elderly patient at that home interact with a robot, a sociable robot named Paro.
It looked like a baby harp seal.
Okay.
It had fur, it had big eyes with large eyelashes.
Pretty eye.
It knew language enough to respond sort of appropriately.
Yeah, how are you?
If you were sad, it made, kind of comforting sad noises.
You are sweetie, you know.
I mean, it was designed to comfort the elderly. And this robot was with an older woman who'd lost a child. And there was a group of us standing around, my research assistants, the head of the nursing home, a bunch of nurses, to watch the reaction of this older woman. And she was pouring out her heart about losing this child. And she was comforted by this robot. This robot made her feel understood.
It was amazing. The researchers couldn't believe how well this old woman was responding to a robot, to Paro.
I looked around and saw that this was being appreciated as progress.
Everyone who was in that room started to imagine the possibilities. Paro as friend to old people, to lonely people, to kids in hospitals. And Sherry Turkle was right there, and she was watching it all happen right before her eyes.
And I felt profoundly depressed. This was a tremendous emotional turning point for me in my research.
It's the TED Radio Hour from NPR. I'm Guy Raz, and on the show today, my robot, my friend, my replacement, the promise and the peril of how we relate to our technology. We're going to hear from TED speakers who all believe this new technology is starting to change who we are as humans, who we actually are. Some say for the better, and some for the worse. So Sherry Turkle, as you've probably guessed, is really worried about where all this is headed. And when she gave her TED Talk, she described that moment watching this old woman pouring her heart out to a robotic seal.
I felt myself at the cold, hard center of a perfect storm. We expect more from technology and less from each other. And I ask myself, why have things come to this? And I believe it's because technology appeals to us most where we are most vulnerable. And we are vulnerable. We're lonely, but we're afraid of intimacy. And so from social networks to sociable robots, we're designing technologies that will give us the illusion of companionship without the demands of friendship. We turn to technology to help us feel connected in ways we can comfortably control. But we're not so comfortable. We are not so much in control.
Isn't there a part of you that looked at that interaction and thought it was amazing? I mean, here was this woman who had suffered a profound loss at some point in her life. She had lost a child, and she was responding to this robot. And it might not have been real, but it was real to her.
Well, no, I don't think it's amazing. And what was extraordinary to me is that although she was surrounded by people who were in a position to understand her story, we were kind of applauding and stepping back and cheering on her connection to a machine that understood nothing. And I really felt, what are we doing? Why are we essentially outsourcing the thing that defines us as people? You know, we care for our young, we care for our old, and outsourcing it to something that we knew was essentially deceiving her by tricks into thinking that it cared for her at all. That was how.
So when Sherry
we
Turkle
had
gave her
set up
TED
the
Talk last
moment,
year,
was that we were
it
going
was like a
to
public confessional because
see
15 years earlier, she also gave a TED Talk, a very different one. It was a talk about how social technology would help us become better, more productive human beings. But then she changed her mind.
Okay, so we're gonna stop there, and I'm going to raise a few questions here. I do want to acknowledge Angus to just ask a really great question in the chat that I'm absolutely going to come back to. Because after this, I'm just going to give you some takeaways, and then I'll answer broader questions about all the lecture content. But while the audio clip is still fresh in your mind, I would love to hear from you about whether or not you share Sherry Turkle's concerns. Do you agree with her? Do you disagree? Do you think she's making a big deal out of nothing? Do you think it's a pervasive problem? Do you think there are limits on the role that AI should play in our lives? If so, what do you think those limits might be? Do you think regulation is needed here, both in terms of broader regulation, or do you think there are ethical implications that marketers should be taking in mind? And do you think that culture might play a role here? And if so, how do you think culture might play a role? Those are a few questions for you to toss around. Now, I'm going to rely here on the Q&A function a little bit. We'll see if that gets going or not. But obviously, in a classroom, I can tell you we hear very, very, very different perspectives, and people generally are going to have some strong opinions about this topic. But I think it's a really great example of a topic that really highlights the richness and diversity of the MBA class, because depending on people's cultural background, geographic location that they're from, industry angle, etc., they have very, very different views on this topic. And so it's nice in a classroom environment to sort of get those different perspectives. Not seeing any kind of comments or questions about this in the chat. I can kind of, well, here's one. Thank you, Shushil, who says, it's probably not as harmful as she suggests. Wouldn't the people seeking help pick an AI-based assistant or human one based on what is better for them? So certainly thinking about kind of the use cases, and particularly in this case, patients suffering from dementia and depression, one could argue, who are we to judge whether or not this is actually helping those individuals? There are certainly data-driven indications that interacting with these seals does actually help patients feel better. And so one argument could be, people should choose for themselves. And so I guess that would be kind of against regulatory, because we believe in the freedom of choice and that consumers should be able to decide whether or not for themselves this is good for them. Christian mentions that it brings up an interesting philosophical question. AI brought about the results, and unless we're in her position, it's quite difficult to judge. Yeah, I mean, I think that there are very different perspectives to look at this from. I think one perspective is thinking, well, what's truly best for the patient, particularly if we're thinking about maybe grandma or grandpa in their last days, and particularly if we're thinking about the place where Paru actually was developed, which is Japan, which has an upside down triangular shaped demographic where you have an increasing number of increasingly kind of growing elderly population with very few young people to support it. And so maybe we could argue, well, humans would be maybe a better substitute, but if that's not an actual possibility, maybe having Paru is better than having nothing. Samantha mentions it's interesting to hear Sherry's concern about how Paru is replacing the human connection. And then Samantha's drawing the comparison with pets, which is very interesting. So again, here, I think it's interesting to think about this from the patient or user point of view and how that might change their situation, but also interesting to think about what it means for kind of the caregivers. Is it the case that we will start relying on Parus as a crutch? Like, I don't have to visit grandma because because Paru's with grandma, and does that strip us from our responsibilities and needs for compassionate caregiving? I think is a fair question. In terms of whether or not this applies, the same thing applies to pets, I think is a really interesting question. I think some people would argue, well, at the very least, we might be kind of tricked into anthropomorphizing pets and thinking they have more feelings and capabilities that they do. But at the very least, they are sentient creatures who can really feel something when we pet them, who need to be fed and watered and taken care of, as opposed to a relationship with an inanimate object, which is more of a one-way relationship, which has its pros and cons. Rita mentions AI, that it depends. That's almost always the right answer, is that it depends. That AI has benefits, especially when it helps people's standard of living. Here in the case of addressing loneliness, which is absolutely a pandemic in and of itself, loneliness, partially driven by some of the demographic trends, as I mentioned before, in certain populations with an increasingly large, lonely, very touch deprived, by the way, we haven't talked about the census yet, very touch deprived population. And so, why should we be regulating it if it can have these positive effects? I think it's also interesting that you say it depends on the situation, because one could argue, again, to try to relieve somebody from suffering and bring them some sort of comfort and happiness in their final days might seem a little bit different than, let's say, Paru as a babysitter and sort of, for people at a young age. I see Selena here. I think it's the same comment in both places, so I'm going to just read it here in the chat. Selena, who is a doctor, offering her opinion. Thank you. I think such modern technology can add some benefits, but should not replace the human interaction. Even though therapies have become better, more efficient, leading to longer overall survival rates, patients in her experience don't necessarily feel treated better because there's a lot less interaction time. I think that is so true. I attended this talk that I thought was so interesting that was actually about telemedicine contexts. And in this particular study, they actually found people reported higher levels of satisfaction with their physician when they had that interaction via telemedicine, so like video conference or whatever it happens to be, as opposed to face-to-face. And when they and the assumption was, oh, okay, that's because it's more convenient, or you're at home, so you're more comfortable, or these sorts of logical things. But actually what they found is in telemedicine interaction, the physician is looking at your notes on their screen, but it gives the impression that they're actually making consistent eye contact with you as a patient, which is so meaningful to those patients. Whereas when you went in the office, you'd have the physician kind of looking at the computer, then glancing at you kind of once in a while. And even if it was a long interaction, certainly didn't feel like a personal interaction. And that can feel so important, clearly, as as the study found. So I think that's a really great point that you bring up, Selena. And Samantha, thank you here for bringing up cultural nuances. And so Samantha says the incorporation of robots and non-human entities to act as companions and support systems are more common in Japan. It'd be interesting to look at kind of what's happened there. And I think this is a great example of how, lots of kind of new products and new product development is meant to fulfill needs that are already existing in the marketplace. And as I mentioned, if you have a population, an elderly population that's growing, and you just do not have the human, as much as you want those human resources to support the population, you just don't have them, then this is filling in that need. So there's the demographic aspect here. I think it's also interesting to think about how this would apply in cultures where elderly tend to live with their children. So in certain cultures, for example, in Southeast Asia, grandparents don't go live in a nursing home. They end up living with the family, and maybe they even start kind of watching the kids, so you don't need a babysitter. And so maybe there's less of a need for these sorts of products in such cultures, etc. So lots of different ways I think that culture could play a role. Just again, we still have time if anyone else has a comment. I mean, I think everybody's bringing up really good points here. I do want to leave a couple of minutes to just wrap up and then address some broader questions, including Angus's comment in the chat. So with this in mind, just a few takeaways, what I'd hope you'd walk away with after this lecture would be, first of all, an appreciation for the fact that consumer interactions with technology are sensory rich and becoming increasingly sensory rich. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think it doesn't, that might not seem obvious at first. It might think that, technology is a bit sensory poor, but that is very much changing deliberately based on consumer demand and also being pushed by tech players accordingly. As products get smarter, and we talked about this a little bit, one of the other trends that we didn't discuss today that we would have in class discussed before this has to do with decision automation. But in general, as products get smarter, we rely on them in different ways. Paru, I don't know that Sherry mentioned all the details, but costs about $5,000 because he is built with all different types of sensors, can learn, to respond to the name that you prefer to call him, learns through emotion and other sensory sensors what sorts of interactions or sounds, etc., that you like the most, and kind of constantly collects data and adapts to be a better companion for you in a more bespoke manner. But as we rely on them in new ways, and some people, again, very different perspectives on whether or not this is a good thing, it will have consequences because these products aren't passive agents. They are collecting data. How is that data being used is a great question. They're capable of recognizing our emotions. How is that being used is a great question, etc. But the one thing that we didn't talk too much is kind of about how this relates to the sensory aspect. And, I wrote here, sometimes nothing is more powerful than how a brand or product literally makes you feel, because that is so easy to overlook when we're spending billions on artificial intelligence, to forget about something as basic as how powerful touch can be. When I see the videos of patients interacting with Paru, that's immediately kind of a huge part of the appeal. The cuddliness, they can hug and touch and pet Paru in a way that would be really hard to mimic. I think that comfort would be very hard to mimic in kind of, again, a cold, metallic embodiment of AI. I want to touch upon these other two comments we have. One from Sneha. I do share her concern, which is how do you draw the line between what's real or what's not? In this case, it's justified, maybe it's not in others. And then I think that comes to kind of a broader question of, should there be regulation so that you don't feel like you are tricking people? I know at one point there was legislation that was going to require voice-activated assistants to remind people every once in a while that they weren't actually human beings, because if people are kind of tricked into that, they actually divulge more sensitive information than they would if it was very salient to them that they were speaking to kind of a non-human data collecting device. And then Christian saying, yes, the flip side of emotional comfort is potential emotional manipulation and exploitation. So it's really interesting to think about how these sorts of things are being used in context is extremely important. And I think that actually somewhat relates to Angus's question, which relates to some of these concepts more broadly. Angus asks, it seems there's a vast ocean of applications. Are you aware of any companies or organizations using these insights to address issues such as climate change or other global threats? Are there possibilities that come to mind? So absolutely. So I mean, I've taken a bit of a narrower approach here and focused more on kind of advertising and stereotypical marketing implications. But there's all sorts of different effects in kind of more pro-social applications. I can think of a few examples off the top of my head. So when we talk about AR and VR, there is a huge literature and lots of research looking at how these sorts of technologies can help increase people's empathy for the environment, increase people's empathy for individuals who are suffering from political displacement or other types of displacement or suffering in other types of ways. Some of my own research, which I've done in collaboration with Oxfam and UNICEF, has looked at VR specifically and what sorts of VR content can actually inspire that empathy in a way that encourages people to donate. Because actually, since VR transports you in many ways, even though people call it an empathy machine, doesn't necessarily make you empathetic. It makes you very conscious and almost feel like if what's happening is happening to you. And actually within that frame of mind, if that content is too negative, then you tend to actually retreat from wanting anything to do with the organization and donate a lot less than actually if it was more on the positive side of things, allowing you to feel, for example, in the case of displacement, allowing you how to feel what it would be like to then, after being displaced, be in a situation where you have safe shelter, access to basic necessities, kind of focusing on the kind of more positive outcome as opposed to just the negative side. So we've been doing some interesting work there. I think also if you think about other pro-social areas like the digital divide, and thinking about how there's differential access to technologies and the benefits of the technologies, it's really interesting to think about what I call kind of sensory surrogacy, which is how sensations or technology, sensory-based technology, can help compensate for certain abilities that could be lacking. So as an example, with augmented reality glasses, there are lots of emotional recognition applications that can let you know what emotions the person you're speaking to is feeling. So if you are somebody who suffers from certain types of autism or Asperger's, and it's very difficult for you to discern that, these glasses allow you to say like, oh, that person I'm speaking to is feeling sad right now based on what I said, or angry or joyful, or whatever it happens to be. The idea being, if you constantly have those cues, then that's something you can learn when it might be something that you didn't have before. And so that's like one example of it in terms of neurodiversity. But there are also examples of how, for example, haptic vests that you might wear can actually hear sound and translate that into vibration patterns, which you can then start to learn as a language. And so if you are somebody who is hearing disabled, that allows you to kind of hear through feeling, which is fascinating. And then, glasses that allow you to see, and then through an earpiece, if you're blind or suffer from poor eyesight, can like tell you what you're seeing through the computer's eye, which is a camera. So lots of different examples. You're right. The word used, I think, was an ocean of applications. Absolutely, no shortage of applications, many of which I think are really exciting, and which we discuss in class a lot, because a lot of people come to the business school with sort of more kind of social impact career goals in mind. I think we are out of time now. If I want to respect your time and the schedule. I'm not sure, what comes after this. I'm not sure if I should hand this back to you at this point, Megan. But I really enjoyed all of your comments. Thank you so much for participating. It's really not the same, but it feels like I'm just speaking to a screen. So it is really nice to see that there are, assuming you're not bots, which is something else we discuss in class. It is really nice to see that there are humans interacting with this content. So thank you very much. And, you can easily find my email address on the SBS website. If you have any questions about course content or anything at all, I'm very, very happy to answer those questions. I should warn you, I'm supposed to have a baby in like 2 weeks. So at that point, I'm probably dropping off for a few months, but certainly before then, please do reach out, and thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rhonda, for that really insightful and thought-provoking session. I hope everyone who's joined today has found it engaging and it's given you an idea of what a lecture at Oxford will look like and feel like, although hopefully more face-to-face discussion in a real-life lecture theatre. Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you also to my colleague Sophia Jeffries for organising this series of experience events. We have a variety of sessions being held tomorrow between 9 AM and 5:30 PM UK time. If you're not able to join us live, then we will be sending out the recordings for most of the sessions. So please do make sure that you're registered to receive these. Finally, big thank you to Rhonda for giving up her time this afternoon to lead this taster lecture. So thanks again, everyone, and take care.
Bye-bye.